She stood at the edge of the playground, a tall, awkward girl in clothes that never seemed to fit right. The other children were a whirlwind of screams and laughter, a closed circle. She tried, sometimes, to step into that circle. The response was usually a silence, a turned shoulder, a giggle she couldn't understand. Her voice, when she tried to use it, felt too loud or came out too soft. She was different. And in the world of children, different is a dangerous thing to be. Her name was Octavia. And her greatest sin, it seemed, was that she lived inside her own head. While the other kids played tag, she was watching ants build their cities in the cracks of the pavement. She was wondering what the clouds were saying as they drifted past. She was hearing stories in the rustle of the trees. But when she tried to share these things, the world seemed to look at her with a flat, uninterested eye. The loneliness was a physical thing, a hollow place in her chest, a constant, quiet companion. One day, defeated, she walked away from the noise of the playground. She didn't know where she was going. She just walked, and her feet, as if they had a mind of their own, carried her to a set of heavy wooden doors. She pushed one open, and the world fell away. The silence here was different. It wasn't the silence of rejection. It was a waiting silence, a full silence. Rows and rows of books stood like quiet guardians. The smell was of old paper and dust, and something like promise. A stern-looking woman sat at a high desk. Octavia approached, her heart pounding. "Can I help you?" the librarian asked. Octavia's voice was a whisper. "Can I have a book?" The woman slid a small, white card across the wooden desk. It was the most important object anyone would ever give to Octavia Estelle Butler. A library card. With it, she didn't just borrow books. She escaped. She built a new world where being different wasn't a curse. It was a superpower. This is the story of how that lonely, dreamy little girl, armed with nothing but a library card and a second-hand typewriter, would climb a mountain no one like her had ever climbed before. And she would change the stars for every one of us who came after. Octavia was born in 1947 in Pasadena, California. Her father, Loris, shined shoes for a living. He died when she was just a baby, so she never knew him. Her mother, Octavia Margaret, was the center of her world. She worked as a maid. She cleaned other people's houses, doing hard, physical labor for little pay. To support her daughter, she often worked multiple jobs. She came home exhausted, but she never came home defeated. Octavia's mother was her first hero. She was a woman of immense dignity and quiet strength. She taught Octavia to work hard, to be honest, to rely on herself. But she also carried the scars of her own life. She had been born in the segregated South. She knew the bitter taste of racism, of being told you are less than. Her love for Octavia was fierce and protective, but it was also practical. She wanted her daughter to have a safe, stable life, a job with a pension, something secure. The idea of being a writer that sounded like dreaming. And dreams, for a poor black girl in the 1950s, could be dangerous. They could set you up for a heartbreak. So, young Octavia was a child of contradictions. She was painfully shy, a stutterer who hated to be called on in class. The other kids, both black and white, teased her mercilessly for her height, her shyness, her daydreaming. They called her outsider. And they were right. She was an outsider everywhere. But at home with her mother and her grandmother, who also helped raise her, she was safe. They filled the house with stories, not from books, but from life. Stories of survival, of faith, of their family's journey from Louisiana to California. Octavia listened, and her imagination began to stitch these real-world struggles to the fantastical worlds she found in her library books. She discovered science fiction and fantasy in those library stacks. She devoured magazines with stories about rockets and aliens and futures. But she noticed something. All the heroes looked the same. They were almost always white men. The few women were usually there to scream and be rescued. And she never, ever saw anyone who looked like her mother, or her grandmother, or herself. The futures in these stories had no place for her. It was another kind of loneliness. Even in her escape, she was an outsider. One day, a thought struck her. It was a simple, revolutionary thought for a 12-year-old girl. She was watching a terrible science fiction movie on television. The acting was bad. The plot was silly. And she said to herself, I can write a better story than that. It wasn't arrogance. It was a realization. If the stories she wanted to read didn't exist, she would have to build them herself. She went to her mother and asked for a typewriter. Her mother, practical as ever, asked what it was for. Octavia, terrified, whispered her dream. I want to be a writer. There was a long pause. Her mother knew how hard the world was. She knew the odds. But she also saw the fire in her daughter's eyes. A fire she recognized. The fire of someone who needed to create to survive. So, she scraped together the money. She bought Octavia a big, old, manual typewriter. It was the second most important gift she would ever receive. Now Octavia had her tools. The library card for fuel. The typewriter for building. She began to write. She wrote every day, after school, before her chores. The clack, clack, clack of the keys became the soundtrack of the house. She wrote stories about aliens and time travel. But slowly, almost without her realizing it, her own life began to bleed onto the page. The characters started to face problems that weren't about laser beams. They were about power. About who gets to be in charge. About what happens when someone is told they are property. She was weaving the history her mother told her into stories about the future. But the outside world was not impressed. When she was 13, she gathered her courage and submitted a story to a science fiction magazine. It was rejected. The rejection slip was a small, cold piece of paper. It felt like the turned shoulders on the playground all over again. She kept writing. She finished her first novel when she was still a teenager. She sent it out. Rejection. Again and again. The publishers weren't just saying no. Their silence, their form letters seemed to say, people like you don't write stories like this. This isn't for you. The conflict wasn't just with publishers. It was within herself. The voice of practicality, her mother's voice of loving concern, echoed in her head. Be a secretary, people would tell her. Get a good job at the phone company. Writing is a hobby, not a life. Even her own family, who loved her, worried. They saw her staying up late, typing away, her stories piling up in boxes, and no money coming in. They saw the pain each rejection caused. They wanted to protect her from that hurt. Their worry felt, to Octavia, like a lack of belief. It was a quiet, constant tension. Love pulling in one direction, and an impossible dream pulling in another. To support herself, she worked every job imaginable. She was a telemarketer, a potato chip inspector on a factory line, a dishwasher. She worked at a warehouse packing boxes. She worked for a temporary agency, doing mind-numbing clerical work. These jobs were not just for money. They were lessons. She worked alongside people struggling to survive. She saw how systems could grind a person down. She felt the exhaustion in her own bones, the same exhaustion she saw in her mother. And every night, no matter how tired she would come home, sit at her typewriter, and write. It was her protest. It was her way of saying, I am more than this job. My mind belongs to me. She started going to writers' workshops. Here, she faced a new kind of conflict. She was often the only Black person in the room, the only woman. Her stories, which dealt with race and gender and class, made some of the other writers uncomfortable. A teacher once told her that science fiction was about escapism, that her stories were too political, that she should write about something else. She listened quietly. She nodded. And then she went home and wrote exactly what she wanted to write. The loneliness of the playground had followed her into adulthood. But now, she was starting to wear that loneliness like armor. It was proof she was on her own path. The years piled up. Rejection slips filled a drawer. Then a filing cabinet. Octavia was in her 20s now. The dream that had started at 12 was starting to feel heavy. The practical world was winning. She was tired. Deep in her bones tired. The voice that said, maybe they're right. "Maybe this isn't for you," was growing louder. Then, a glimmer. She heard about a workshop being run by a famous writer named Harlan Ellison, all the way across the country in Maryland. It was a long shot, but something pushed her to apply. To her shock, she was accepted. But there was no money for the trip. Her mother, seeing this one desperate chance, stepped in. She gave Octavia the money she had been saving, a small nest egg meant for emergencies. It was an act of faith that left Octavia speechless. Her mother was betting on the dream. The workshop was a hurricane of ideas. It was also brutal. Ellison was famously tough, but he saw something in Octavia's work. He didn't tell her to make it less political. He told her to make it sharper, to hone her strange, powerful voice. For the first time, a professional in the field was not dismissing her. He was challenging her to be better. It was a turning point. From that workshop, she sold her first 2 short stories. They were not big sales, but they were validation. A door had cracked open. She returned to California with new energy. She began working on a novel unlike anything she had written before. It was called Kindred. The idea was terrifying in its simplicity. What if a modern Black woman was suddenly, violently pulled back in time to the antebellum South, to a plantation, to save the life of a white boy who would grow up to be her own ancestor? It was not a fantasy of escape. It was a story of brutal confrontation. It forced the past and present to collide in the most personal way possible. She poured all of her research, all of her family's history, all of her own feelings of outsiderness and powerlessness into this book. Writing Kindred was not like writing her other stories. It was emotionally draining. It felt dangerous. She was forcing herself and her readers to stare directly at the heart of slavery, not as a historical fact, but as a lived, bloody, psychological nightmare. She finished it. She sent it out. And the publishing world hesitated. Editors didn't know what to do with it. It was science fiction, but it was also historical fiction. It was a novel by a Black woman that didn't fit neatly into any category they had. The rejections came back with comments like, "It's too harsh," or "Our readers won't understand it." This was the breaking point. After Kindred, after all the workshops, all the small sales, this was the book of her heart. And it was being rejected. Octavia was now in her late 20s. The hope from the workshop was fading. The money was always tight. The years of working day jobs and writing all night had taken a toll. She sat in her small apartment, looking at the manuscript of Kindred. She looked at the towering stack of rejection letters. She thought about her mother's sacrifices. The loneliness of a lifetime pressed down on her. For the first time, she seriously considered giving up. Not out of anger, but out of a deep, quiet exhaustion. The dream felt like a mountain she could no longer climb. She had reached her limit. But a writer's mind doesn't turn off easily. Even in despair, Octavia was thinking. She realized something. She had been trying to climb the mountain by the path everyone else used. The path laid out by the publishing houses of New York. And that path was closed to her. So, she decided she would not play their game anymore. She would not wait for their permission. She would become a strategist. She would use her years of observation, her understanding of systems, to build her own ladder. She made a plan. A ruthless, practical plan. She called it her 5-year plan. She would stop writing short stories for little money. She would focus only on novels which paid more. She would study the market like a scientist. She would identify a publisher that might be open to her unique voice. She found a small, new publishing house called Doubleday. They were starting a new science fiction line. It was a target. She then did something extraordinary. She wrote a novel specifically designed to be a commercial success. It was called Pattern Master. It was a compelling, action-packed story about psychic warriors and hierarchies. It still contained her deep themes of power and control, but in a more accessible package. She wrote it with pure, disciplined focus. She submitted it to Doubleday, and they bought it. Pattern Master was published in 1976. Octavia was 29 years old. She was a published novelist. This was not the end of the struggle. The advances were small. She still needed day jobs. But she had a foothold. And now, she used that foothold to do what she had always wanted. She went back to Kindred. With a published book to her name, she had a little more leverage. She submitted Kindred to her new editor. And in 1979, it was published. The world was not ready for Kindred, but Kindred was ready for the world. It did not become an instant bestseller, but it began to find its readers. Slowly, steadily, like water finding cracks in stone.
Teachers started teaching it.
Readers passed it to their friends. They wrote to her letters that spoke of how the book had changed their understanding of history, of family, of trauma. It was not just a book. It was an experience, and it cemented Octavia's purpose. She knew now that her role was not to provide easy escapism. It was to tell necessary stories, to use the future and the fantastic to force us to look at our present. From that point, her career was a steady, unstoppable climb. She wrote the Xenogenesis trilogy, now called Lilith's Brood, a profound and unsettling story of alien integration that questioned the very nature of humanity. She wrote the Parable series, which imagined a dystopian America collapsing under climate change and greed, and a new faith, Earthseed, based on change and adaptability. She wrote ceaselessly, brilliantly, and with each book, she broke new ground. She became the first science fiction writer ever to receive a MacArthur Fellowship, the Genius Grant, in 1995. The award was not just money. It was a message, loud and clear, from the world of arts and letters. Your voice is essential. We see you. Octavia Estelle Butler died too young, in 2006, at the age of 58. She left us too soon. But she left us a library of worlds built from a lonely little girl's imagination, tempered by a working woman's hands and sharpened by a prophet's vision. Her story is not a fairy tale of sudden discovery. It is a blueprint of stubborn, strategic faith. It is the story of a woman who heard no for over 15 years and responded not by shouting, but by thinking, by planning, by working harder and smarter. She redefined strength. It wasn't about being the loudest in the room. It was about being the most persistent in the quiet of your own mind. It was about taking the very things that made you an outsider, your race, your gender, your perspective, and forging them into the keys for your own kingdom. She once wrote 2 simple sentences on a notepad and pinned them above her writing desk. They were her mantra. They were the lesson of her life. She wrote, "Tell stories filled with facts. Make people touch and smell and know the new world you've created." And then just below it, "So be it. See to it." That is her lesson for us. So be it. Accept your story, your difference, your dream, and then see to it. Do the work. Make the plan. Type the words. Day after day, year after year. Build your world page by page. When you feel like an outsider, remember the girl in the library. She was not just checking out books. She was checking out the tools to build a future. A future where someone like her could not only exist, but could shape the destiny of galaxies. She handed us all a library card. And she taught us that the most powerful spaceship, the most transformative time machine, the most revolutionary weapon, is a mind that has decided, quietly and forever, to see to it. Thank you for listening to her story with me today. If it moved you, please tap the like button. It helps others find these quiet, powerful tales. And consider subscribing to Real Story Wisp for more heartfelt journeys that remind us of the strength in a single, persistent dream.